CMCL305 Modernity, Assignment 3. Presented by Elena Stiro, Phoebe Fuller, Janelle Alfonso, and Dawson Enns. Edited by Nelson Boyce. Imperialism and Colonization.
Interpreting modernity during the process of colonization can bring to light the reasoning behind cultural and political war. Galileo claimed the most significant issue while interpreting modernity at this time was that the Church had a monopoly on societal belief. As a result, interpretation was restricted to being internal, based off of spiritual beliefs, revolving around God as a higher power. Galileo alludes to the idea that modernity should be interpreted through an external lens in order to separate truth from belief. Be that as it may, the internal perspective should be considered when interpreting moral dilemmas. It is of overwhelming opinion that the Church played a crucial role in the development of imperialism. Hobson analyzes spirituality as justification for imperialism with the desire to circulate Christianity on a global scale. The colonization of the Americas has been a pivotal milestone in the development of numerous significant world affairs. Ferry explains how colonialism is an international manifestation of the eternal laws of competition. Ferry explores how export markets are the solution to preserving the status of a nation. He continues to propose that imperialism is necessary in order to maintain status and to not fall to superior races. Furthermore, when nations start to partake in global trade, the peace between them collapses and imperialism becomes national in effort to preserve economic stability. The debut of imperialism was associated with the establishment of colonialism in the 16th and 17th centuries. In Friedrich Nietzsche's reading, The Greatest Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche interprets imperialism as a product of mass society buying into a form of national security. Nietzsche explores the idea that the lunacy imperialism was made on represents a deeper delusion and distress that underlies modernity. Modernity is examined in the reading as being fabricated through the actions of mass society and the cultural avenues that they explore. Nietzsche takes into account society's morality regarding national defense, furthermore interpreting that an explanation for imperialism is a warrior morality possessed by society to protect their country. A key component to Nietzsche's interpretation was the Judeo-Christian beliefs held by society in the 16th and 17th centuries. Nietzsche analyzed how society interpreted and acted on their spiritual beliefs. Furthermore, proposed that a leading reason to imperialism was based on the Judeo-Christian belief that good equals weakness. Associated with this belief was that the good, the weak, will go to heaven, and that the bad, the strong, will pay for their acts of violence in hell.
Industrialization and Capitalism.
Industrialization and capitalism. Throughout modernity, the world saw an overall increase in commercial goods and wealth as industrialization made things faster to make and cheaper to buy. The increase in production power saw an increase in consumerism and accumulation of wealth in the hands of those who controlled the means of production. From the Industrial Revolution emerged the presence of a surplus of money and goods, which no longer were used just to get by, but to gain even more capital. This process that we've come to call capitalism became and remains the dominant economic system in the West. However, it was certainly true then, as it is now, that not everyone benefits equally from a capitalist system, as it usually serves to uplift the few at the expense of the many. The irony of modern capitalism is that despite the stark increase in wealth and productivity, European nations still saw ongoing poverty. A strong sense of individualism became key to capitalism's social acceptance, placing the burden of poverty not on institutions or government, but strictly onto the individual's shortcomings. So how did Europe find its way to a capitalist system, and why would the common people stand for it if it exploited them? To answer this, we have to go back before the Industrial Revolution began. The imperial competition throughout 17th century Europe sparked rigorous economic growth as each nation strived to obtain the most ships, gold, and land and become the most dominant European power. At the time, Europe operated under mercantilism, a system of economic regulation which strived to strengthen the state by encouraging the growth of local industry and maximizing supply of gold and silver. Mercantilism sought to make the state self-sufficient so as not to help drive the economies of other nations through trade. It posited a direct correlation between the greatness of one nation and the weakness of another through an assumed finite amount of wealth available to be distributed among the European powers. However, by the late 18th century, mercantilism had garnered critics who favored the benefits of a free market over government intervention in the local economy. One such critic, Adam Smith, insisted that giving people the freedom to act in their self-interest was key to a powerful economy. He rejected the mercantilist claim that wealth was finite and believed that a nation's wealth would grow independently of others with a successful division of labor and a free market. Smith theorized that allowing people to work in their own economic interests would not only benefit the individual but the nation as a whole, and that free consumption would create a continual balance of supply and demand. He saw a shift from nationalist to individualistic motivations as key to economic success. The problem with Smith's theory is that it operated under an assumed meritocracy, where people would find success in the capitalist system based on their merit and the system would be equally fair to everyone. Capitalism did not turn out to be the win-win scenario between citizens that the state and Smith made it out to be. As free market capitalism became the norm, especially as industry continued to advance and grow, the myths of this theory would become very evident. By the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was in full force, and with it came mass urbanization as workers flocked from rural areas to factories and urban centers emerged around them. The European industrial complex was plagued by horrible working conditions, long hours, child labor, poor housing, and non-existent sanitation. The lives of workers were devalued and consumed by labor. As Peter Glasgow wrote in 1833, factory owners, quote, considered the human beings who crowd his mill from 5 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock in the evening, but as so many accessories to his machinery, end quote. These conditions continued into the 1840s, where capitalism's paradox of extreme productivity alongside extreme poverty came into full view. In response to rampant class struggle and the poor living conditions of workers, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels brought forth the most infamous critique of capitalism in 1848 with the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels framed all of history as a class struggle, but posited their present time as uniquely antagonistic and plagued by a stark division between, quote, two great classes, end quote, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. As the owners of the means of production, the bourgeoisie had an obsession with excess wealth and superproductivity, resulting in a society plagued by, quote, the epidemic of overproduction, end quote, all at the expense of the working class. Marx and Engels articulated the capitalist contradiction which had roots in Smith's theory of the free market, that the freedom to consume is an illusion ultimately dictated by an enslavement to the capitalist machine. Fulfillment through external means like money and goods was merely a band-aid for the alienation felt due to the restrictive nature of the class system. This creates a vicious cycle of labor, alienation, and then consumption, which then requires more labor and begets further alienation. The Communist Manifesto did result in a rising class consciousness, but not the widespread economic revolution necessary to end European class struggle. As poverty raged on, someone had to take the blame. By the mid-1800s, that blame had successfully shifted onto the shoulders of the individual, whose position in society was thought to be solely the result of their own determination and moral virtue. Samuel Smiles was one proponent of such ideas, publishing a variety of self-help books which advocated for social improvement through good education and thriftiness. Smiles framed the poor as uncivilized, resembling, quote, the savage tribes like the North American Indians, end quote. He problematized wealth inequality as not the fault of the flawed system, but the fault of the poor for being self-indulgent and ungrateful, giving into vices and lacking good morals. With Smiles, modernity's focus on the individual comes full circle. The capitalist individualism, which was cemented by the Industrial Revolution, associated the value of human life with their capital and contributions to the market. The lives of workers were devalued, while the owners became more valuable as their wealth and capital grew. Modernity's focus on individualism and accumulation of wealth as a determination of worth can still be felt today, as people blame the poor or disenfranchised for their misfortune and push back against social supports like welfare.
Exploration of the big idea. So one of the things that Trump has been going around saying is that welfare recipients are making more than some people who work their butts off, that welfare is a system that actually denigrates work. This is true. Okay, the left has been very upset about Trump saying this sort of thing. How dare Republicans say that the welfare system benefits people who don't work as much? It benefits people who don't work as much.
Capitalism remains the dominant economic system, and we still largely buy into its myth of meritocracy. But the age of modernity shapes citizenship today in ways beyond work and money, also shifting the structure of a household and roles within the family unit.
Relationships, gender, and citizenship.
Political, social, and economic change can shape the ways families are constructed and the ways in which families function. The dominant systems of power, such as capitalism or the patriarchy, assert control over groups of lesser social standing, like women and those who live in poverty. These systems of power insert themselves into the households of common citizens and exert control and authority over how each individual should conduct their lives, even in the privacy of their own homes. A strong aspect of modernity is the fight against power, as we see in the upheaval of monarchy and religion, as well as in women's suffrage movements. To see how family and citizenship have changed under the pressures of modernity, it is important to look back at how people lived in the past. I will first begin with a dialogue from 1443, written by Leon Battista Alberti. This text gives guidance on how the wealthy and powerful families of Florence should act, specifically in terms of how they should marry and how individuals should act once in marriage. At the time of this dialogue was created, men were overtly dominant over women. To be morally upstanding, women were to focus on housework and childcare and were not to bother themselves with their husbands' affairs. Husbands were even discouraged from confiding in their wives. Women were to be docile and subservient, to follow their husband's will first and foremost. This is why men were directed to court young women who were still inexperienced in the ways of the world and were thus pure and impressionable. As Alberti said in his dialogue, girls are eager to learn their husband's habits and desires and acquiesce without any reluctance. At the time, women had no freedom. They were to live under the control of their husbands. A similar ideology is espoused in Kaibara and Token Ekiken's Greater Learning for Women, written during Japan's Tokugawa period. This text explicitly states the rules under which women should behave. Women are to be completely under the control of their husbands. If a wife should show any signs of self-will, she will alienate the affection of her husband and eventually be ousted from her family, according to Ekiken. For a woman to fulfill her duty as a human, she must idolize her husband and obey her husband without question. Men dominated women, and it was a woman's duty to be dominated. In both Alberti and Ekiken's writings, women were under the control of men. With such a harsh demarcation between men and women, and with women being oppressed so forcefully, it seemed inevitable that modernity would begin to set in and change the way men and women were understood within the context of the family and society as a whole. We can see this change begin to take place in the 1600s, with Dodd and Cleaver's advice book titled A Godly Form of Household Government. It is important to note that this was some of the earliest evidence of change, and thus does not hold up under the understanding of gender and equality prevalent in contemporary society. Unlike the previous two texts, which argued that the foundation of marriage was built on childbirth and familial glory, the authors of this text claim that the ideal marriage is constructed from love and affection among other virtues. Unlike Alberti, Dodd and Cleaver argue that for a marriage to be successful and emulate godliness, both the husband and the wife must be completely honest with each other. The authors of this text seem to view men and women more equally than previous texts. However, this text is still not fully modernist. Though the modes of power, the patriarchy, is beginning to lose its strong influence, men and women are still not equal. The authors see women as weaker and in need of protection by men, a sentiment which is not held by many women today. The text is also deeply immersed in Christian modes of thought, which is another dominant form of power. This is evident in how the authors describe the duties of a husband and wife. Spouses are to love each other primarily as practitioners of the same faith, not as individual people. The freedom of roles in the family may be greater than in the past, but it is still beholden to the dominant religion of the time, which allows for only a man and a woman to enter into marriage and to bear many children. This book still directs action within the household under the rules of Christianity and limits the freedoms of individuals. As time passes and modernity takes a stronger hold on society, the groups who are oppressed by the controlling systems of power begin to gain more power against their oppressors. This is evident in a speech given by suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst in 1913. In this speech, Pankhurst explains how women fighting for their right to vote was seen as violent, interrupting civility and upsetting the status quo. These characteristics of the first wave of feminism are representative of many different political revolutions and reform. One reason Pankhurst gave for the violent fight for women's suffrage was that she and many other women like her couldn't wait for change to eventually come. They fought for the change to happen immediately, and they needed the change to happen as soon as possible. If women were to remain law-abiding and tried to make change happen from within the system, movement of power would likely not occur. The feminist gender revolution at the core of this text is a central aspect of what modernity is, a battle between those with power and those without. Many of Pankhurst's feminist sentiments are widely accepted as the norm today, and aren't as controversial today as they were in the past. While changes in gender roles and dynamics are the most direct ways shifts in power can affect the family, transformations of political and economic natures also impact the individual. Shifts from monarchies to democracies placed a significant amount of power into the hands of the ordinary citizen. But the movement of power away from powerful families was not always a peaceful one. This upheaval of dominant power structures is significant in understanding modernity.
Revolution and reform.
Progression into modernity begets change, requiring a break in the mold of what is and questioning if that is what is best for the people it affects. This applies throughout history, from reforms to social movements to riots to revolutions, and it still makes its way into modern-day relevance. Modernity itself is a response to the old ways as they are replaced with the new through various methods of change, but one similar goal: accommodation of peoples going forward. This accommodation comes as a response to a feeling of discontent over the treatment of a people or thing, with components like religious beliefs, human rights, and gender equality being major components throughout the recent modern era. Dostoevsky touches on religion and adapting as a more modern Russia in The Brothers Karamazov, with a commentary on intention as well. Quote, "He claims it as a merit for himself and his church that at last they have vanquished freedom and have done so to make men happy." End quote. While accommodating the wants of people, the measures discussed taken by the church are misrepresentative of the people they claim to be aiding, which prompts dissent amongst the brothers. Quote, "Man was created a rebel, and how can rebels be happy?" End quote, is another excerpt soon afterward that touches on a similar sentiment about reformation, discontent. Rebellion is defined as the action or process of resisting authority, control, or convention, and is often shown in acts of violent or open resistance. Martin Luther's excommunication from the Church is a non-fiction example, with his part in the Reformation of the Church the result of a rejection of practices of the Roman Catholic Church. Luther's umbrage came from a negative view of indulgences and disputing the authority of the Pope, taking issue with the class disparity intrinsic to the Acts. His proposal that the Bible is the lone source of divinely revealed knowledge, and that salvation was given as a free gift of God's grace, both undermined the authority of the Church and provided what were previously seen as exclusive privileges to everyone. More recent examples of the importance of change can be seen in the French Revolution's execution of Louis XVI, the American Civil War, and even modern movements like Black Lives Matter, each seeking equality and fairness for the people being treated poorly by others. The French Revolution was prompted by a lack of resources and rights offered to the lower class of French citizens, and began as an intent to correct this and create conditions more sustainable and equitable for the people afflicted by poverty. As citizens revolted against the royals and others deemed enforcers of the disparity, the guillotine became the tool used to put down the upper class, and is referred to as a symbol of uprising in the cultural zeitgeist still. The rights of citizens were ultimately changed as a result of the revolution and the end of an era of royalty to be more accommodating. Touched on earlier, the American Civil War resulted in the abolition of slavery, but the rights of African Americans were not made equal and immediate. with later events such as the American Civil Rights Movement pushing to end segregation and racial discrimination formally. The rights of all races were intended to be equal as a result, and laws were made to change after the pushback against the unfair practices, which were previously seen as just in the eyes of the law. It should be noted that despite the conclusion of the American Civil Rights Movement, the issue of racism is still ongoing in the United States, and dispute over the current systems in place reinforcing such is as well. Thomas Hobbes discusses the ability of the people to change legislature to accommodate them or anyone else in Leviathan, stating, quote, "To the care of the sovereign belongs the making of good laws. But what is a good law? By a good law I mean not just a law, for no law can be unjust. The law is made by the sovereign power, and all that is done by such power is warranted and owned by every one of the people, and that which every man will have, so no man can say it is unjust. It is in the laws of the Commonwealth, as in the laws of games whatsoever the players all agree on, is injustice to none of them. A good law is that which is needed for the good of the people, and clearly understood, for the use of laws, which are but rules authorized, is not to bind the people from all voluntary actions, but to direct and keep them from hurting themselves by their own impulsive desires, rashness, or indiscretion. As hedges are set not to stop travelers, but to keep them in their way. And therefore, a law that is not needed, having not the true purpose of a law, is not good. A law may be thought to be good when it is for the benefit of the sovereign, though it be not necessary for the people, but it is not so." End quote. In saying this, Hobbes reflects that a law that does not benefit the people should be changed, and it is within the rights of the people to change it. Discussions of a sovereign and class disparity continue into current events as well, with recent financial and social discontent against large corporations like Amazon or Facebook, rather than royals or empires. Though the defiance of corporations comes in comparatively smaller acts, like pushes to buy locally or to delete applications become the predominant revolutions against the status quo, talks about it remain a hot-button issue, with the rights of workers and consumers being in question under companies now.